Nah, we don't need a professional to fell these trees. Okay, this is a story of how my dad, with my consent but against my advice, accidentally weaponized a tree. I live in the capital of a Central European country and recently visited my parents at the countryside. They needed me to help to deal with some trees that they wanted to fell. I assumed they wanted to finally make short work of the semi-healthy trees along the driveway that kept branching in the way. But no, they decided that the row of beeches at the southeastern corner of the property had to go. You should know 3 things here. 1. Those trees are really, really tall, like 15 meters, which is about 50 feet, and rather thin. 2. There's an equally high barn just a few meters behind those trees on the neighbor's property to the south. It's pretty old, but it's been renovated time and time again to serve as a storage and party location. 3. In front of the trees are compost containers, a crooked walnut tree, and bushes that my mother planted, creating a corridor of only around 7 meters, or 23 feet, for the trees to land in without breaking anything. Also important, my sister, also living in a bigger city and not present when these events took place, and I are actually the co-owners of the house and the property as my father transferred ownership to us some years ago. While so far those beaches had survived their fair share of storms, they'd probably become a problem as they kept growing, and since new neighbors on the property bordering on the eastern side are in the process of building a house, they'd be their problem as well, so I agreed they had to go. However, my parents wanted to fell them by themselves, meaning my dad would be the one to operate the chainsaw on them. He worked as a technician before retiring, always did a lot of repair and building work in and around the house, but he's past 70 and has adopted a rather unhealthy lifestyle after leaving the workforce, and his eyesight and motor skills, while still perfectly suited for most kinds of technical operations, have deteriorated a bit. Knowing this, I objected and suggested hiring a professional to do the job and sharing the cost. I argued that any damage, beechwood is pretty heavy, or injury that might occur if these things went sideways wouldn't be covered by insurance and thus come in quite costly. Also, doing this without even as much as notifying the local authorities might be illegal. Okay, it's the countryside. If any regulations of such kind even exist, folks here like to interpret them as friendly advice rather than actual law, but I digress. My parents wouldn't have any of it and even refused to get an estimate from a professional. I did some basic research and found out that the cost would probably come in at around 500 to 1,000 euro, which is $600 to $1,200. Not a small sum, but the forester or lumberjack who'd take up the work would be responsible for any damage. No dice, even after trying to bring my points across several times. "Oh no, we don't need a professional. Why should we waste money when we can do it by ourselves?" they said. "It'll be fine," they said, literally. And while I usually am able to put them off bad ideas by convincing one of them, this time both were hell-bent on going for it. And once that's the case, all hope is basically lost, as especially my mother can be most stubborn as heck. At least I know who I inherited this trait from. As property co-owner, I technically could have just forbidden my parents to fell those trees on their own. But they're my parents and I love them. They're adults, they live there, and they keep the stuff in order, so I refrained from taking this route. So I told them that they should go ahead if they really want to, but I would not help them with this. My mom asked if I would help them by cutting it up and then carrying the wood once the trees were laying on the ground. This is an important aspect, and I agreed. Also, I begged them to wait for my sister to call them the next day at lunchtime, since I messaged her about the situation and she wanted to back me up. But no. Next morning, I was woken up by my mother calling me to help cutting up the first tree, which my father had brought down successfully. So I dutifully crawled out of bed and did my part in this little deforestation project. Tree 2 and 3 out of 5 also were felled without any incidents. Then came tree 4. My father had apparently not seen a higher up branch that stretched between the branches of tree 5. So once the chainsaw had fully severed the stem, instead of falling sideways as intended, it got caught up, swirled around its axis, and crashed into the walnut tree, which started to bend significantly due to the load. Now, they wanted me to help move the beech by pushing it to roll along the edge of one of the walnut tree's main branches. Besides me knowing that this was not doable, as I said, a 15-meter high tree is a heavy affair, I refused. "But you said you'd help us once a tree is felled," they pleaded. I pointed out that I'd only assist once it was laying on the ground, and leaning into the walnut tree doesn't quite fit that definition. More pleading, but now it was my time to be stubborn, and rightfully so. Since there was no way to, or machinery, to pull that beech away, my father decided to cut parts of its lower stem until handling would be possible. Multiple laws of physics, however, intervened after he had cut the second large chunk, shifting the center of mass of the beech so that it suddenly started to tilt when its branches prevented it from sliding downwards as intended. Then the walnut tree reacted to the lighter load and shift of the balance by springing back, knocking the beech into the neighbor's barn like a battering ram. The dry wooden wall planks didn't stand a chance and splintered away as the felled tree forced its way into the building, creating an impressive hole. My parents now stood there, dumbfounded. My dad slowly scratched his head and tried to realize the situation, while my mother slowly started to panic. "Oh no, what do we do now? What if the neighbor calls the police on us?" I had watched the spectacle from the balcony and couldn't decide whether to be shocked or to descend into uncontrollable laughter. Closer investigation from outside showed that the tree had crushed a chair, a table, and also caused a cupboard with party equipment to collapse. Though my dad had at least reached his goal and freed the beech from the grasp of the walnut tree. But there was no way of getting it unstuck from the barn without entering. A few hours later, the neighbor, who knew about my parents' plans, returned home, which is where this story might have taken a very bitter and costly turn. But he proved to be a very gracious guy and took the incident, which, in the worst case, could have made the whole barn collapse, in stride. He first was negatively amazed by what had transpired, but after inspection of the barn, he didn't deem it necessary to involve the insurance or the officials and said he would repair the damage by himself if my parents agreed to pay for the materials, the replacement of the destroyed furniture, thanks neighbor, and some beer, probably a lot of beer, for his time, which they gladly accepted. His bill isn't in yet, as he has just begun patching up the hole, but it will easily be upwards of €2,000, roughly $2,400, plus the beer, of course, still making a professional tree removal look like a really good deal. My father offered him to assist with the repairs, and the neighbor thought about it for the fraction of a second and then politely declined. I wonder why. P.S. Tree 5 is still standing. I ruined your weekend. That sucks. About 10 years ago, I was a regional manager for a transportation and logistics company. At the time, each regional office worked as sort of an independent company in that we had our own sales and accounting teams, as well as compliance people like safety and a driver trainer. I'll start by admitting that I never fully got into accounting. I took the class in college, but honestly, it was still confusing. I'm not totally lost looking at the reports, but how they get there is Greek to me. I chalk it up to black magic. Our accounting department was the largest office team with a whopping 3 people, the accounts manager and 2 clerks, 1 for accounts receivable and 1 for accounts payable. All the other teams were just 2 people. We also had maintenance and loading dock crews, but they weren't part of the office. Well, in their infinite wisdom, our corporate office decided that they were going to merge some regions as a cost-saving measure. To be fair, it did save money, but it greatly increased our workload. I had all my departments submit a report on what they needed in order to meet the increased load. The loading dock manager actually had a brilliant plan that involved only hiring 1 new worker, promoting 1 to be an assistant manager, and then putting them on rotating 50-hour weeks. It was cheaper than hiring a bunch of guys, and they all agreed to it. The maintenance shop wanted 2 more mechanics, but this isn't about them. The accounts manager asked for 2 additional A&R clerks. I was hesitant at first, but then I saw the amount of paperwork that they had to process now, so I authorized it. The accounts manager used the spreadsheets, along with necromancy, to summon billing documents from the void to send to our customers. It was a pretty efficient system. I had a policy regarding overtime. Department managers had discretion to hand out overtime up to 10 hours a week as long as they could justify it reasonably. However, if a manager required a subordinate to work overtime, the manager would work the same overtime. Our managers were salaried and exempted from overtime, and I didn't want them working their people all the time while they only worked 40 hours. Amazingly, after I implemented this policy, overtime went way down. I mention this because, at year-end, the accounting team always needed a ton of overtime in order to get all the closing work done on top of their normal duties. It usually involved them working as much as 80 hours a week for the whole month of January, and usually they only finished at last minute. I usually gave them a 4-day weekend at the end. The accounts manager was usually pretty cool, not entitled, and did a good job. But this particular year, when we had even more work to do, she tried to pull a really BS move. In the middle of January, as they were all working a ton to get through year end, she announces that she'll be gone for a weekend to go to a concert with some of her friends. So I asked her if she had a plan in place to make up for the lost work time with no one here working on the weekend. She looked at me confused. "But the clerks will still be here." I say, "Only if you are too. You are familiar with my policy. I'm okay with you all taking the weekend off, but I need to know that all the year-end work will be done in time." "I do have a plan. They are working the weekend to cover for my absence." To be fair, her clerks probably didn't care, and I would have been willing to ease up on the policy in this case because she usually was pretty good about this stuff. However, her tone completely changed that. I'm easygoing, but my subordinates do not dictate to me how things are going to be, and I told her as much. I finished with, "Either you are all working this weekend or none of you are. Let me know by the end of the day." In the end, she couldn't figure out a reasonable way to make up for the lost time, and she was at the office with her team. I was there too because my policy applied to me as well. The only exception I gave myself was the loading dock crew because there was always someone there on overtime. The accounts manager was pretty cold towards me the whole time, and on Sunday, she informs me that I ruined her weekend. I considered pulling her aside to let her know that sorting through driver paperwork for 12 hours a day wasn't my weekend plan either, but instead just nodded and said, "That sucks." A few weeks later, she did apologize for her behavior, and I told her I was sorry she missed her concert, and that unfortunately, that's a part of working life. Sometimes we miss out on things. Funny enough, she said that her friends thought the concert sucked really bad, and even told her that she was lucky she didn't have to go. And yes, the way we did accounting was stupid. I fought my higher-ups over it for 4 years. I also fought to get the higher temps to help year end, but after 2 years, they let me get 3 for the month. It helped a lot. My overtime policies cut annual overtime for the office down so much that I got everyone under me a 15% pay increase. So, I stand by it. A Dangerous Game, posted by Kurorosu. This is my first post here. I decided that this may be another method of catharsis for me. I do have many stories peppered throughout my life that I want to share, but this was the first one that came to mind. This one has to do with my childhood and dealing with a psychotic and racist aunt and uncle. When I was a child, I was often assaulted and bullied for being a mixed-blood kid, mulatto, by both my own family and kids in school. There are many things that my aunt and uncle did to me and got away with, which I will share the highlights of later. This story, however, is not one of those. My uncle was the alpha tormentor between the two. Both my aunt and uncle still lived with my grandparents, so there was no way to avoid them because I had to go to my grandparents' house after school while my dad was still at work. My uncle liked to play games with me in order to turn me into a fearless pit dog, as he put it, when I asked him one day why he was tormenting so much. When he said that, the fact that he was being completely honest as well as smiling about it, I decided right then and there that this man was my enemy and would have to deal with him accordingly. If he wanted a pit dog, he was going to get one. After overcoming my shock of his honest answer, I said, "F you, uncle, just F you." One of the games that he loved to play was chasing me down the road to my grandparents' house, which felt like an honest attempt to literally run me over. He'd always do this as I was walking home to my grandparents' house after school. Luckily, most times he ended up just chasing me off the road. The game started like this. He would stop his truck at the end of the road that my grandparents' place was on and rev the engine of his truck 3 times. That was a signal that the game was about to begin. After the 3rd rev, he would hit the gas and come screaming down the road toward me. I would have to leap off the road to avoid being ran over. After at least a couple of months of dealing with this, I had enough. I was tired of feeling afraid of walking down that street. I thought it over for a while before I decided that I would get revenge. On the days when I wasn't being chased, I started to count how many steps it took to get to an old stump on the side of the road that was hidden by briars. I'd walk backwards just so I could eye the distance between the end of that road and the stump so I would know when to run. 17 steps. It would take 17 steps from the time he'd start roaring down that road at me to get to that stump. The day finally came about a couple weeks later. When I heard his truck, I wasn't afraid anymore. I was angry. As per normal, he revved his engine 3 times and then gunned it around the corner. I waited until he was close enough before I ran as fast as I could up the side of the road and behind the stump, throwing my backpack into a deer trail that I could jump into just in case my plan failed, and then quickly turned around towards the stump and the oncoming truck bearing down on me. As expected, he followed me up the side of the road, too fixed on me to pay any attention to where he was going. The next few moments were beautiful. The briars parted like the Red Sea, and to my delight, I saw his eyes go wide as he realized what he was about to smash into. He yanked the steering wheel to the left, his front right tire going over the stump, which launched him into the air. As he flew past me, I could see the look of terror on his face, and grinning madly, I began to shout insults at him as his truck nearly flipped in midair. Instead of flipping, the truck roughly came back down on four wheels, and he continued down the road to my grandparents' house and parked in the gravel driveway. I grabbed my backpack, ran up the trail, and hid. I didn't come out until after dark when my dad came to get me. I knew the sound of my dad's car, a Datsun B210, so when I heard him coming up the road, I immediately came out, waved him down, and quickly jumped into the passenger seat. My dad asked me concerned as to why I was out there. At first, I just kept telling him over and over that we needed to just go straight home and under no circumstances go to my grandparents' house. When my dad kept asking why, I finally told him everything that happened. Without another word, he turned the car around, silently fuming, and drove us home. I don't know if my dad talked to my uncle after what happened, but what I do know is that game never happened again. That game, at least. A woman let her dog crap on the airport floor, so I crapped on her plans, posted by the Hofstetter. While walking to my gate at LAX, I noticed a woman whose dog was in the middle of doing its business. The woman was loudly FaceTiming with her back to the dog, so I assumed she didn't notice. That was likely the thought shared by the gentleman who tried to get her attention. "Excuse me, miss," he said in a polite tone. The woman glared at him. "Your dog," he sheepishly continued, pointing to the mid-poop pup. The woman rolled her eyes and went back to FaceTime as the man slinked away, seemingly embarrassed. "Some people," she bellowed to her FaceTime companion with no hint of irony, "are just so darn rude." When her dog finished, the woman started walking away, leaving everything right on the airport floor. Another woman tried to stop her. "You're not going to clean that up?" she asked, as shocked as the rest of us were. "They have people for that," the offender replied, disappearing into the crowd as much as someone yelling into their phone can disappear into a crowd. I stood near the pile and warned people to walk around it while someone else got a maintenance worker's attention. No one said anything. We were so shocked that anyone could be that horrible. When I got to my gate, the woman was there too. Great, we were both going to Tokyo. When I travel abroad, I get embarrassed by other Americans doing things 100 times less embarrassing than leaving animal feces on the floor of an airport. To make it worse, her dog was now barking at everyone who walked by. I have nothing against people flying with their dogs, I do it often, but it's a privilege I take seriously. My dog is well trained and behaves better than most people. He certainly behaves better than that a-hole. Speaking of a-holes, there's a pet relief area inside LAX, past security, just 2 gates away from where the party pooper let her dog go to town. It didn't matter. She was the type of person to litter 3 feet from an empty garbage can. While her dog barked at the world, the woman had moved from FaceTiming with no headphones to listening to music with no headphones. I don't like to throw around the word sociopath, but I don't know how else I could explain just how selfish and terrible of a person she was. I'd bet her car was somewhere in the long-term parking, parked across 3 spots with the paint on the bumper from the child's bike she hit without leaving a note. Everyone else tried to ignore her, sitting as far away from her as they could. I am not everyone else. I sat down right next to the horrible woman. Are you going to London on business? I said. I'm going to Tokyo, she responded gruffly, annoyed that I interrupted her DJing. Oh, I said, then you better hurry. That flight got moved to gate 53C. This is the flight to London. I figured I could give her a little moment of panic as payback for how terribly she was treating everyone. I didn't predict what would happen next. She grabbed her bags and her dog in a huff and stormed out of the gate without even checking. She was so self-involved, she didn't notice that the monitor at our gate still said Tokyo and almost everyone at the gate was Japanese. Based on her actions, she believed me that the flight had been moved, so now she's an a-hole for not thanking me. Some people, I thought, as I watched her rush away from the gate without stopping her, are so darn rude. The flight to Tokyo was at gate 69A, so the 53 gates were on the other side of the next terminal. And I felt guilty knowing she probably berated some poor clerk who had to explain to her that there was no gate 53C. I don't know if she made it back to this flight before we took off or not, but I didn't see her board and I don't hear her dog. Her missing her flight was not my original intention, but it would be a fine punishment for her being so rude to everyone and making a low-paid stranger clean feces off the floor. What makes me wonder if I went too far is the knowledge that Delta only has one flight to Tokyo each day. Oops, maybe she can rebook on another airline. I hear they have people for that.
Karen thinks she owns my property. I make her regret messing with me. Click the video on your screen. You don't want to miss a fallout of this one, and I'll see you there.